Bozzai, Book 1, Underneath the Mansion's Moonlight. Chapter 1. Storms were common in this place of the world, so the entire household wasn't very amused by the fact that lightning was crackling and thunder booming. But whether a storm was raging or not wouldn't have changed his mood in the slightest, not living here anyway. Most mornings were rough and annoying to him, that is. Being yelled at, ordered around, forced to clean up after just about everyone else was normal, even though he hated it. Many people would call Pal ungrateful, since, before this, he was an orphan living on the streets, barely finding any food or shelter. But being grateful was more of an insult to his situation. In his mind, living on the street was less stressful than this place. She called it a palace, he called it hell, and her son called it heaven. As for the other maids working at the mayor's mansion, they enjoyed mostly free days. Besides the chores and comforting friendships, he was the odd one out. Pal's story as to how he ended up here was one of tragedy. He never knew his parents or family, if he had one, and never even understood what it was like to receive a loving hug or kiss. He had lived his entire 16 years on the streets of several different towns and cities. And, despite having a roof over his head and 3 meals a day, it all sucked. The worst part is that he wanted to go back on the street. No one seemed to want him around, so why did she take him into her home in the first place? And that's the exact mood he woke up in. The storm was raging outside. He could hear and see water hitting his window, and the audible thunder spooked him. Pal's room was nice. That was something he had to admit. His bed was pushed against the wall, furthest it could be from the door. A nightstand stood beside it. 2 windows were on the front wall, which gave him vision to the garden outside, and a table bearing a potted plant sat gracefully between them. His dresser was just at the foot of his bed. A loud boom filled the air, causing Pal to jump and bring the covers over his head. Pal wasn't acting dramatic, either. He was legitimately afraid of thunder. He lay curled up like a baby, and probably looked like one. If anyone in the mansion found out he was afraid of thunder, they'd make fun of him until his ears bled. He didn't want to move or get out, despite the fact that he'd be punished for not getting out of bed when Judy called. A knock at the door alerted him. He already knew who it was. The owner of the mansion, Diana, called out his name. Pal. She made sure to make the annoyance in her tone loud and clear. Pal lifted the covers off his head. His bed head looked rough. Yes, ma'am, Pal called back, the nervousness audible. It's time to get up. I shouldn't have to tell you this almost every morning, said Diana, annoyed again. I'm sorry, ma'am, Pal apologized as he left his bed. I'll be right down. His tender feet softly touched the glistening wood floors. But before he could get dressed or fix his hair, the door swung open. Diana was standing in the entrance menacingly. Her arms were crossed and she carried an upset look. Her fire-like hair didn't help to change that image. Pal, she said his name again sternly. What is taking you this long? You should have been up an hour ago. Pal utterly refused to admit the truth as to why he stayed in his bed for so long that morning. The poor boy stood still, unable to say it. Did puberty hit? Diana joked, lifting an eyebrow. Pal's face turned blistering red. No, ma'am, I promise, that's not the reason, he stammered desperately. Diana, clearly amused at his embarrassment, continued to berate him. Oh, really? So the reason for you staying in your night clothes, not fixing your hair, which is too long anyways, and sitting in your bed for so long, isn't because of that? At that moment, Pal wanted to curl into a ball and die. He felt completely vulnerable and fully uncomfortable. Was there any way of getting out of this besides telling the truth? Pal's eyes glazed over with tears. Diana was still standing in the entrance looking at him. Several of the workers had passed by. Pal tried to speak, but the words would not come out of his innocent mouth. He lowered his head, feeling ashamed. Sorry, he finally said on the verge of tears. Diana smirked at his embarrassment. You should be thankful I'm so kind to you, she said in her typically cynical manner. You have 10 minutes. Get dressed and get to the kitchen where you aren't getting breakfast. She stopped just after turning around and peered over her shoulder. And Pal, stop playing with yourself. Pal held his emotions until Diana left. Once she did, he rushed to the door and immediately began to cry. Although some mornings were rough, this one was particularly rough.